All right, welcome everyone to another podcast with me, Ben, and Sophie. We are here today talking about, so it's kind of following on from our last one around asking what's been better, and yet we want to focus on second sessions, and I suppose second and subsequent sessions. And Sophie, you kind of raised this, and it's something Ben and I, as Ben said earlier, we've had this before, but tell me a little bit about your thinking and what you want to explore from this.
So I wanted to talk about this because I'm relatively new to SF. So I'm obviously kind of engaging with a lot of the kind of initial training materials. So whether that's kind of brief or sort of reading any of the books or doing the solution focused universe training as well. And I've just and I've been aware from the very beginning that there's this enormous focus on the first session, all those things that kind of like the points that you not supposed to hit, but that you can hit in that first session that will make this a truly solution focused session.
Mm.
And and particularly when I started up, and I think actually this came up in supervision with you, Greg, when I first started up, is like, but what about what about the second session? It seemed to me, and it continues to seem to me, that the discussion of the second session is well, if it is being had, then I'm not I'm not aware of where it's being discussed. And I just think
Mm.
that's a really fascinating not necessarily decision, but kind of impulse and trainers of SF. Because if
Mm.
you can contrast it to other types of therapy, it's, like let's say CBT, it's very clearly, session by session by session. First, you do this in order to get to that point, and that point gets you to this point. And obviously, that's kind of particularly sort of manualized or particularly sort of disorder focused. So you're working with a particular cognitive model of how how our minds work. But any other, types of therapy might be, the relationship over time, what's kind of developed, etc. Whereas SF is so focused on helping people with that first session. So I wanted to find out more from you guys about why you thought that was, how you conceptualize your second sessions and subsequent sessions. Yeah, what do you say to people who say, "Wait, okay, I've got it for the first, but what happens when they come back? What am I meant to do? What am I supposed to do? What am I not allowed to do?" I mean, I recognize this is kind of, I'm saying that kind of humorously,
Yeah, yeah.
but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Go on, Ben. I'm going to put you on the spot first this time. It's always me going first. Your turn.
Okay, fair enough. I feel like I should, given that before we started recording, Sophie was like, "There's a massive spider behind you." I feel like I should clarify what that is as well. So that is the Albanian flag for anyone who's wondering, which is where I'm currently living at the moment. And it's a double-headed eagle, I think, rather than a spider. There you go.
Mm.
Bit of random flag trivia for you.
Shows how good I
Um,
am at flags as well.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Sophie's point, and we could talk about our own training, Greg, which I think, if we're honest and we reflect upon it, does spend a lot of time on initial sessions and not so much the follow up. Why is that? Two reasons come to mind for me. One would be the accreditation in the UK, which is based largely upon, well, it has to be a first session, right? To pass the accreditation,
Yep.
you have to show a first session with someone. So naturally, if we're training people to pass their accreditation, we are going to focus on what will help them pass their accreditation, which is learning to do first sessions, really well. I think the other part that's probably true is also a sense of there's nothing new in follow-up sessions. So if you know how to do an initial session, then you should be able to do the follow-up ones, the repeat ones, because every component of a follow-up session is including, it's the same skills as everything in an initial session. The same skills being used, maybe in a different order, maybe with a different emphasis, but the same skills. Now, I don't think that's a particularly good stance to have. So I'm not defending that, but I think that's probably the like subconscious kind of thought process that's fueling some of it. Is that the idea of if someone can do an initial session, they'll be able to do a follow-up session. I think that's probably part of the thinking that's driving that. What do you reckon, Greg?
I would agree with that. Um, I think from a training standpoint, it's a lot easier to talk about those various structures or parts of the process within the context of a first session.
Mm.
Um, I think there's a bit more certainty, or it's easier to sort of break them down. And I think with those subsequent sessions, you just never know what you're going to get as an answer. So when you say, oh, what's been better, or, I suppose even saying what's been better, there are some people who might not start with what's been better. They might just say, what are your best hopes from our talking today? And so their subsequent session is very similar to the way they would start the first one. Which I suppose, Ben, goes to your point around everything. Hopefully, everything you would use in a follow-up is the same as a first session. And there is something. I go back to I mean, when I was trained in it, there was a little bit I remember from the brief guys, and it was it was broken down into that simple, you're gonna get one of three responses, which is either things are better, or things are worse, or they're the same. So it was almost broken down like that. But everybody always has those questions. Well, what about if they say this? What about if they say that? How are you going to respond to it? Um, and I think probably one of the biggest things for me that isn't talked about as much in the first session, but is connected for me more maybe in that for those follow-up ones, is that whole idea of like the acknowledgement and possibility aspect of things. I know we kind of talk about it, but I think it's linked to hearing and validating people potentially more, and then being able to move on into a question to kind of invite that sense of possibility. Don't know if that makes sense, but often for those first ones, it seems to be, you ask, what do you want? What are your best hopes? What's that desired outcome you're after? What does that look like? Or when have you had it before? Maybe scale it, all that sort of stuff. Um, but I think, yeah, maybe that's just what comes to my mind at the minute. But there's more of that having to listen and validate where someone's at, and then ask your next question. I think comes out more in those follow-up sessions, just from a training standpoint. Not saying we shouldn't be doing it all the way through in our practice, but I think from a training standpoint, that's what comes to my mind.
So it's sort of like it's less predictable,
Mm.
and therefore it's easier to train the first sessions due to their increased predictability a bit. I guess thinking about it, probably true that for me, first sessions typically start with like, preferred future. After you've established a desired outcome or a hope, I'm probably spending time looking at future focused questions and then moving into past resources most of the time in an initial session. Whereas probably in follow-up sessions, the the lines between the future and the past maybe are a little bit more blurred. Maybe I'm sort of weaving in and out of that a bit more frequently, rather than having a chunk that is future and then a chunk that is past. You'd probably see a bit more dipping in and out, future past, future past. Is that the same for you guys, Sophie? What tend to be the differences, I guess, between your initial sessions and your repeat follow-up sessions?
Well, I think to kind of speak to your points about sort of what is different is that one of the things that I've always taken away is that we we are at our most useful when we have a sense of where somebody wants to go, because that then informs all your questions. And so in the first session, it's very clear you establish that without that you don't have yet a solution focused conversation. And then what my understanding, I think from the sort of brief training and brief sort of writings, is that the kind of subsequent session is if it's a what's better and there have been things that are identifiably better, you don't do a sort of check-in again for the best hopes. You say, and if that thing that is better, or what allowed you to kind of do that thing, or whatever you drew on there, were to show up more, in the coming days? What would you notice? And so it seems to build on what is said initially rather than
Mm.
drawing on potentially the richness of what's been said before. So if I think about any one of my sessions, there's so much that people say and so many questions I never get to ask. And then I always kind of think, you know, like I had one of those sessions today where I have like, we don't have enough time and I've got all these questions, but I know that the next time I meet this person, I'm going to check in with them, what's gone in the right direction, it's been better, etc. And that there's going to be a kind of a loss of the richness of that vocabulary if I don't deliberately bring it in before you were talking about, X, Y, and Z. And I think that for me, um, because there is so little training on the second session, I don't then have, I mean, I make a judgment call on, the richness of the, the conversation that we're having in the moment. But I don't know sort of what I'm allowed to do. So I keep on talking about it in terms of, permission or not. But I think that that's kind of one of the things you do when you're entering into a new space, a new type of conversation,
Mhm.
and you're trying to sort of get guidance, and you want to sort of stay faithful to certainly the principles, but also the practice of it. Because there's not much talk about the what happens in the second session. I don't then necessarily have people who have said in training or in writing or whatever, oh, no, I always refer back to that first session, particularly if there's things that we didn't
Mm.
kind of pick up on or not. I never do that
Mm.
because you don't need to, because blah, blah, blah. So I'm not saying that there has to be a sort of right or wrong answer because, the more I do, the more I talk to you guys, the more I read, etc.
Mm.
The clearer it is that you're navigating your own kind of path through this. But to me, it is helpful to have other people talk about what they actually do in practice because it then allows you to say, oh gosh, okay, well if they do that, then maybe I could. And I'm sure that in supervision, you guys have said to me, you've said before this is important to you, and
Mm.
so I've kind of experienced a little bit of that kind of drawing on past conversations coming into our current conversations, but I ain't seen it written down. So does it exist if it's not in an article or a book?
Yeah.
Mm.
Does it exist if it's not in an article or a book? What a great question. Um, yeah, I mean, so that's a great question to raise. Do we refer back to the first session? Do we refer back to somebody's hopes or desired outcomes that they've named? Um, I'll let Greg answer that one in a minute. I think just to sort of nail down the other part of what you were saying, Sophie, in terms of the that weaving between past and future, I think an example that comes to mind is if I asked someone what's been better since I last saw you, and they said I've been like building some good friendships, I would probably go past first. So how have you managed that? What have you been doing to build good friendships? And then I would move into the future of, and if you continued to build good friendships, what would that look like? How would you know? So I think that's what we're talking about dipping into past, future, and that being a little bit more um, spontaneous compared to the first sessions. Do we refer back to language from the initial session? Great question. The only part I'm going to add is probably the easy part, so I'm going to steal that from Greg. Um, is that my first thought would be to ensure we're using the client's language as closely as possible. Um, so if I am going to refer back to the first session, is it a phrase, is it language that they told me rather than my memory of it? Yeah. Over to you, Greg.
Mm. Mm. No, good point, Ben. Good point. I don't know that I was going to say that actually, so well
Oh,
done.
good.
Um, no, I suppose the thing there's a couple of things that come to mind, and one, I suppose, I don't know if we mentioned it last time or not, but that notion of like change is constant. It's one of those foundational assumptions, isn't it? And I think one of the reasons that my understanding of why we say what's been better rather than a potentially a different way of almost different approaches may set tasks, they might set plans and things like that. And we always say, well, we're not going to go back and say, have you done X, Y, and Z that we talked about from last time? Because, we acknowledge life happens, it changes, and there could be a million other things that they have done well, even if they didn't do X, Y, and Z that we talked about last time. And I think part of that influences my thinking about going back to what they'd said before, if that makes sense. So I think if if I say what's gone well, or what's been better, things like that, and people are talking to me about that, then I'm happy to carry on with that. I think if then it's almost, I suppose I'm taking the cues from the answers to the questions. So it's that whole, I'm co-constructing that with them, as you said, Sophie, to make sure it's useful for them. Because what I wouldn't want to do is almost have my curiosity for the sake of curiosity influence that conversation. I'd be more, I'd want to make sure that curiosity is there to be useful to them. So almost like a checking in of, we kind of finished up last time. We were just talking about these things. Is that something you'd want to carry on with, or is there something else you'd want to get from talking about today? So kind of again, that choice to make sure, as you said, we're working towards what it is thereafter. Um, it's a tricky one. I don't know. Again, I wouldn't say there's like a hard and fast right wrong rule on it. It's going to be but I think you've just nominated yourself to write an article on it as you've been talking. I don't know. But I suppose that, yeah, it- it's that thing. If it's useful and there are certain themes that keep recurring, then I might raise that and just kind of say, oh, you've mentioned this a couple of times before, and then try and build a question around that. That sounds really important to you, and I'm wondering how you've managed to maintain that, or if that thing was to be even more present in your life, like what might you start to notice? Things like that, I suppose. And yeah, in terms of bringing that language through. Um, but I wouldn't want to do it almost as a starting point to think to impose that direction if that's not where that person wants to go with it. If that makes sense.
It does. It also connects to another thought I was having about like the imposing of the direction. Because something that I've noticed is that when you ask people what's kind of been better, right direction, etc., and they sort of describe these things, and then you ask them, if it were more present, etc., etc., a lot of the session can be taken up by that.
Mm.
And I've certainly I've certainly had clients who it can be about sort of like 20, 25 minutes in, and they're like, I'm answering your questions because you're asking them,
Mm,
but this is not
mm,
actually what I want to be talking about.
mm,
And I'm very lucky to be interrupted. Great. But I think that there is a danger if you're assuming that the answer to that question holds the keys for whatever it is that they want in the future.
Mm.
Um, so what my clients have been able to, or the ones that have been able to, have said, we're not talking about the right thing. Like, thanks for asking me all these questions. And yes, it is nice to hear of these successes. But actually, since we met, because change is constant,
Mm.
this has happened, and this is what's on my mind, and this is what I want to talk through. So I think uh, I try and get a balance of when I realize like, okay, oh, right, let's head down this road because
Mm.
you're talking about this kind of stuff and I'm, wondering what that would look like. When I sort of feel myself, I don't know, putting the backpack on and being like, okay, cool, this is the direction, then that's a point to me where I'm like, um, so I've got lots of questions about that direction. I'm also wondering, is there anything else that you want to take? And that can then be a chance that they have in advance to say, well, actually, what I wanted to look at was that. And then you're like, okay, back on, let's head in that
Mm.
direction.
mm,
So I think but I think that that's a danger in not having an explanation about second session,
Mm.
or not exploring that in an explicit way is that you do then accidentally in the spirit of an
mm,
SF conversation you can absolutely impose a direction
Mm.
um, counter
yeah.
to all of your all of your daily health principles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Go on, Ben. You've got something you're going to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've had that experience as well as 20, 25 minutes in, someone saying, can we talk about this? Which is great that they feel able to do that. I'm thinking, where would I, because we're thinking about asking about choice again, aren't we? And like re-examining that sense of direction and are we actually leading from one step behind? Is the client actually just, determining the direction of this? So where would I check in? The thought at the moment that comes to mind would be to sort of start with, so what's been going well, or what are three things that you've been pleased with since I last saw you? Gather those answers, and then maybe at that point, before I dip into how did you manage those, maybe to check in and say, I've got loads of questions that I'd love to ask you about those things, or is there something else that you'd like to talk about today? That's my current thought about where I might bring in that sense of choice. Um, what about you guys? Where might you do it? How might you ask it?
Um, I think mine would be probably similar. And sometimes it almost might be a little bit of, oh, do you mind if, I want to spend a little bit of time because I almost want to say like, and because I suppose I know, well, I believe that's going to be beneficial to amplify those successes, amplify what's working. So I might offer, would you be all right if we spent sort of 5 minutes, 5, 10 minutes on that, and then we can then move into talking more about this thing that you're after. So almost after the check-in, if they're okay with that, then I just say okay, and then keep an eye on the time and everything else. Um, but then that gives me that opportunity to do that in a way that works for them. But what about you, Sophie?
Well, I just wanted to say what a lovely turn of phrase you have. Because when you say, would it be all right if I did that? I can hear how genuine
Mm.
that is.
Mm,
You're really checking. You're not just saying the words, would it be all right if I spend 5, 10 minutes on that? Yeah, you're incredibly thoughtful. So just wanted to acknowledge
thank
that.
you.
No, and I think similar. Although I'm 100% learning from this conversation as well. But I think that perhaps for me that moment of like when it's probably about 5 to 10 minutes in when I
Mm.
realize we're getting into a particular sort of topic that then
Yeah,
I will kind of step aside and check. Um, yeah.
And when you say getting into a particular topic, is that as in like a theme of something that they keep coming back to that they want to talk more about, or like
No,
you?
more as in building on what's been better.
Okay,
So if
okay.
they've been talking about the things that have been going better,
Mm,
as
mm,
I become aware that the next sort of like direction of travel is to sort of dig deeper into that, and as you say,
mm.
amplify it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
That's a kind of pause point for me um, to check in with them.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, definitely.
I like what you said, Ben, before about sort of weaving in and out of the past and the future more in
mm.
second and subsequent sessions. Um, that there's a kind of, I think perhaps that's a nice way to kind of help people sort of conceptualize it, that there are certain sort of, it's like the Mark McCurgo sort of, going into the gallery, that you're going to spend time in all of these places in the first in the
Yeah,
first conversation, but
yeah,
then actually once you've kind of been through the gallery and you know where kind of things they particularly value are, you can actually spend more time in the second and subsequent sessions hopping between the rooms or
yeah,
spending more time in one particular room.
yeah.
No,
I don't think it's quite as linear, which is probably why it's like
yeah.
a bit more difficult to teach. I mean, I really like. Yeah, I also really like what Greg said there about just 5, 10 minutes looking at this, because uh, yeah, I won't name them because I haven't got permission, but I remember being challenged by an SF therapist who I have a lot of respect for, because I love preferred future conversations, and sometimes, doesn't happen that often, but sometimes in follow-up sessions, someone will say to me, I really want to talk about this thing that's happened, and we'll move in. The process always stays the same in SF, doesn't it? Regardless of the topic, you're either gonna find out, someone's hopes and desired outcomes and look into the future about it, or you're going to explore past resources. So in a follow-up session, if someone says, I really want to talk about this thing, this is bothering me, I then might move into so how would you hope to respond to that situation? What difference would that make? Okay. And if that was achieved, how would you know? What would it be like? What would it look like, etc.? And there are times where I will be really pleased with myself because I've done this massive, like really detailed preferred future conversation. And that can happen in both the first session and like the follow-ups. And I was challenged on that once by this other therapist just reiterating the importance of anchoring the person in like past and present resources to sort of give them it was almost like an ethical argument. It was like, I want to give them the confidence that that preferred future we've described can be achieved. And if I don't spend any time at all investigating their existing strengths and resources and efforts, then I am not doing my job properly because I'm leaving them with this vision, with this description, without giving them the sense of I'm able to do this. Paraphrasing, that was the sort of gist of the argument. So for that reason, I do kind of like Greg's point around, is it all right if I just spend 5-10 minutes asking you a few questions about this, and then we'll come on to the other topic. Yeah. Well, go on, Greg, you got a quizzical look?
Well, I think there's something risky about saying like this is what we have to do
Yeah.
in a conversation, I think, because for some people, just like we're talking about, for some people going into that past and even though it's a successful, resourceful past, they're not interested in it. Like that's not what they want. And then as soon as you start asking future focused questions, something clicks and it works for them. And the same is true the other way around. Sometimes future, they're like, what do you, I can't imagine. No, it's too hard for me to think about that thing. So you go back into the past and you spend more time there, and that seems to make something click for them. So I think it's a tricky thing to say, this is what you need to be doing every time. And I think we talked about it last week, Ben, and around something else, but it was that like if we develop our own styles of, well, I like this area. I like doing a
Mm,
lot of this bit. That may not be as useful to somebody else. So it's almost
yeah.
you've got to be, competent and prepared to work in all of those, as Sophie, those rooms in the gallery. You've got to be able to navigate all those rooms. We might be more comfortable in some than others, but I think it's more important to, yeah, go with where the conversation seems to be taking us rather than dictate too much of this is exactly what this person needs, because that's seems like that's what we want to move away from more than anything else. I don't know.
That's quite a, I don't disagree, but I also think that that is quite a big ask to differentiate between where is the conversation taking us and where are we, as the people asking the questions, taking the conversation. Because we're
Mm,
always making those decisions about what to amplify. And how do we know what to amplify? We're already making some assumptions. And so yeah, I
yeah.
agree that there shouldn't be a kind of particular set. You must have visited all the rooms in the gallery for this to have been a good session. But and I also agree that only you are in the conversation with that person. Only you are getting a read of
Mm,
what seems to be kind of lighting them up or making them click, as you said. And it might be that for Ben, the way that you ask preferred future questions engages lots more people than it might for me, say. And so you may just have a very sort of nice way of asking those questions so that you get more of a click And so you stick with it because that's what you're amplifying, because they're giving you the language that you can reasonably assume is useful to them. So I think, does that mean I think I agree and disagree with
Yeah,
the
yeah.
proposition?
Fantastic.
Because I suppose the point, I mean, this is my words, Sophie, not yours, but we don't want to, we still have some onus, don't we, in terms of that direction. We don't want to completely give that up. We have to be mindful of what we're doing and be doing it appropriately and intentionally. It's not just a, let me just start this ball rolling and see what happens. And yeah, let's see where we end up in 45 minutes or half an hour. Sorry, Ben, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think there's just okay, I'll just talk about myself as these thing, but like being aware of our own, even if it's very slight, I guess, kind of like bias towards different areas as well. And actually, my experience, the reason I've ended up where I am is actually because I was finding the past resource conversations easier than the preferred futured ones. Like, especially when I was like training and learning. And what was happening, if I'm honest, is that on the days when I was like really tired and like struggling a bit, I was probably more likely to lean on past resource conversations because I found them a bit easier to do. Yeah. And then I can't remember exactly where it was or in my SF journey or whatever, but I kind of just like told myself off a bit and sort of went off in the other direction, and challenged myself to do like whole sessions that were just preferred future, in the like really fine grained detail stuff that you'll see Chris Iveson doing, all those conversations like what will be different about the way you make your cup of tea in the morning that shows you more focus. And I won't be putting two sugars in it. I'll only be putting one sugar in it, that kind of. Um, and it was like painful to begin with. And then I started to kind of get a bit addicted to it and think, well, this is fun. This is cool. So, um, yeah, so we're like, that's part of our makeup as human beings as well, isn't it? Is that like learning process, those different things we're going through. So I think just being mindful of that is part of this as well. Yeah. And I'm looking at the clock as well. So the question that I want to ask before we run out of time, and
Right.
this goes back to Sophie's point around referencing initial sessions. Okay. If we're not referencing initial sessions or we're not referencing someone's initial desired outcomes or best hopes, what do you guys put at 10 out of 10 on scales when you use scales in follow-up sessions? What different things do you put at the top of the scale?
Mhm.
I probably don't use scales as much as I could slash should.
Mhm.
Um, but for me, I think because the function of the scale is to allow you to be able to find a point, zoom in on that point, understand what's helped build to that point, and then understand what might be a progression from that point, right?
Mhm.
So then scales become the thing that whatever it is that we are just talking about then. So that seems to have there's some kind of like value in it for that person. That then having the most, let's say they hadn't mentioned, I mean, unlikely, but they haven't mentioned sort of confidence in the first session, but then somehow they
Mhm.
mention it in the second one. Then if it's a kind of, I don't know, how in the first session, part of the development of the best hopes, do you have a kind of best hopes which is sort of going to be useful? I remember Chris Iverson saying, is it sort of is it reasonably life-changing? Like if they had this, would it
Mhm.
really change their life? And that's what you're listening out for. Is that a life-changing thing? Which of course, like having, wonderful self-esteem and great confidence and enormous amounts of calm and all those things you can hear. Poof, that would be really life-changing. And then you can hear that in mini, I think, in second and subsequent sessions, that anything that you think that either for that person, well, ideally for that person, but for as you just listen to it on the kind of fly in the conversation, that sounds like a life-changing thing to have. Then you can use a scale to kind of I'm doing that like it's a kind of concertina or an accordion to kind of spread it out so
Mm,
that you can
mm.
then dip into the different points and build on those.
Yeah.
Mm.
Greg, what about you?
I don't know that I use, I think I'm with you, Sophie. I don't know that I use scales as often as I used to. I used to love scales and use them all the time. Um, and I think I use them far less now. But I think it would be, yeah, it would depend. I think there are times where I would use sort of what they talked about in the first session. There might be times where I use what they've been talking about in that current session. Um, if I'm having I don't know, a weird day, I might just do a more generic, like 10 being on track, moving in the right direction, like, things are just working out, in a way that's good for you. I might just make it a bit more general and yeah, maybe not link it as much to what was discussed in the first session. But yeah, that kind of makes me think, and I know I shouldn't mention this now because we're going to have to wrap up, but you mentioned last time, Ben, about asking
Oh
what's
no,
been.
I'd hoped you'd forgotten.
No, no, I wrote it down. I wrote it down. Don't worry. You said
Uh,
something about what's been better being linked to best hopes.
mm,
And I don't
I
think it
did, yeah.
is. I don't think it is. I think what's been better is intentionally just broad and wide, just to be like, tell me about what's been going well and like been better in your life since the last time we spoke. So I don't know what that's something to, I don't know. I want to ask a question, but I know we also need to stop soon. So any final
Yeah, I
thoughts
knew
on
this is
that?
like a
Or should
Saved
I
by the
just,
Bell moment.
yeah.
Like,
This is like the Netflix cliffhanger until the next
yeah,
episode.
yeah.
But also to your point, just pull that apart a bit. What's been good, what's been better, and not the same
Mm,
question
No,
as
hmm
they relate
no,
to the best hopes.
no. This is true.
So, and I don't know whether I'm trying to save Ben in some way, in some
I need saving, save me.
pedantry,
Um, yeah, yeah,
pedantry,
yeah,
angelic
yeah.
descent. Don't worry.
Oh, well,
Yeah, I
let's
mean,
go
oh, go on,
on.
Greg.
No, you go on.
Well,
You get to get the final word.
thanks, I appreciate it. No, I mean, all of these questions, what's been better, what's been good, what's been going well, what you've been pleased with, what you've been proud of, they all have slightly different connotations, don't they? Which, we could spend forever exploring, I guess. I will give a full answer to the link to the best hopes thing. This conversation is throwing up that theme like expanded because, if we're not referencing the first session, then how much impact are those initial best hopes desired outcomes actually having on the follow-up sessions? If we're not placing them at the top of the scale, for example, if we're using a more general, life is going, in a way that's good for you, that you're pleased with, it's it's raising questions, I think, about the importance, the relevance of those initial best hopes desired outcomes for me, which is interesting. And I'm conscious that we may have left if anyone's listening to this, he may have left them more confused than when they started. So we don't have enough time to do this today either, but I think maybe next time it would be good for each of us to kind of spell out, generally speaking, what are our intentions in follow-up sessions? What are we actually looking to do in a typical follow-up session to give people a bit of a grounding of like, okay, well, at least I can start there, and then I'll figure out my own way of doing it. But and I think that's something I remember Brief saying to our classes was that you're super welcome to critique us, but learn to do this first before you critique it.
Yeah.
Learn to do it our way, show us that you can do it, and then by all means critique it as much as you want. So yeah, I think it'd be good people to give people like some different starting points, groundings.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, I really love the idea that we need a second discussion to talk
Yeah,
about second discussions.
yeah.
Brilliant.
That's what happens in these conversations. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, let's stop there. We'll leave it on that wonderful note. Thank you all very much again for joining us. And yeah, hopefully we will be setting up a time to meet again soon and carry on this wonderful conversation. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Cheers, everybody.
Awesome. Speak to you soon.
Bye.